Okay, today we continue on with our sermon series that's covering the fruit of the Spirit. Now, I really love good and fresh donuts. And I'm guessing in a room like this, I'm probably not alone in that. And have you ever found yourself, you go to the donut store and you come home with that fresh dozen donuts, and at first you might practice a little restraint, right? A little bit. Maybe you sat down and perhaps you're like me and you like to get a true variety. So you might have 12 different flavors. Maybe you've got 6 different flavors. And so you begin, and this is what the Stones do, and this might annoy you, and that's fair too, but we like to cut ours in quarters. So yeah, I knew there'd be someone. And that way you can sample some of those different flavors. And so you cut them up, and you can sit there and enjoy maybe 6 of those quarters. So you're like a donut and a half in, right? And so maybe that takes the edge off. Tastes good. So you walk away for now. And then somehow you end up wandering back through wherever you left that donut box there. Maybe it's in the kitchen or on the table. And so all of a sudden you see him just hanging out. And so maybe you go and you have one more little chunk of donut. After all, at that point, it just feels like you're having a little vitamin of a donut, right? It's just a quick vitamin, take it, move along. Donut vitamins are the best. That's my favorite vitamin. And so maybe you go then back to your living room, or maybe you have a seat somewhere, and you're scrolling through your phone. Maybe you're catching up on some emails. You're doing your thing. And then inevitably, you find yourself back out at the donut box again. And you cut off a piece or two, and this goes on and on, right? That can endlessly go on until they're gone. And before you know it, and I hope this is somewhat relatable, maybe you've consumed about 4 donuts that Saturday morning. And all of a sudden you kind of realize how many you've consumed because you're getting a little bit of the sugar sweats is what I call that, where you're feeling a little queasy. It tastes good going down, but it's a little, not the best. And so you think, if only I could have exerted a little bit of self-control after that initial trip to the donut box. And even better yet, for me, this is where I'm at, what if I didn't even bring any donuts home with me at all? I know. Everybody'd be sad in my house. It's probably fitting that self-control is the last virtue that is listed in the fruit of the Spirit found in Galatians chapter 5. It may actually be the most personal of all aspects of the Apostle Paul's list. It certainly is the most inward looking. The struggles that we have with things like anger and addiction and fears and excess and laziness and avoidance all happen inside of us. Our struggle with these kinds of things is concealed, but the results, or maybe what we'd call the evidence of self-control or lack of self-control, shows up on the outside of a person. Our worst defeats or our greatest victories are all very public. And while the bulk of our virtues that we've been covering, just to name a few, would be peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, they can all be expressed on or with other people. We can only exhibit self-control on ourself, which makes us wonder, possibly if you're like me, if self-control is me acting on me, then why would it be in this list of the Spirit's work in us? Isn't it by, characterization self-produced? Now, if we look at kind of our cultural idea of success, I think self-control plays heavily in it. We think of the self-made person that is supposed to demonstrate that they have mastered their time management. Can't be a waster of time, right? And you don't have to, I'm not asking anyone to out themselves besides maybe Jesse back there. But they've mastered their time management, their desires, maybe their exercise regimen, maybe it's their eating habits, and they've certainly mastered, right, having a good mindset. Self-control seems to be a feature that's high up in our thoughts of what it means to be successful. And so here we are in church today. And if we are Christians, wouldn't we think, isn't God supposed to be in control of us? Shouldn't we be shooting for something like God control rather than self-control? I think this one sticks out a little bit, and it doesn't quite seem to fit, at least at first glance, in this list of all these virtues of the fruit of the Spirit. So why is it on this list? And there's some good news, if you didn't know this was coming, that the Apostle Paul does have quite a bit of things to say about self-control. So to get us started here in our text today, we're going to jump into Romans chapter 7. And I've always really loved Romans chapter 7 because it's very honest from Paul. And we're going to read this little chunk of scripture is going to come out of the Message version. It gives us a little new ears to hear this text. This is Romans 7, starting at verse 15, going to be going through 20. Says this, "What I don't understand about myself," this is Paul talking, by the way, "is that I decide one way, but then I act another, doing things I absolutely despise. So if I can't be trusted to figure out what is best for myself and then do it, it becomes obvious that God's command is necessary. But I need something more. For if I know the law," what's right is what he's saying. If I know what's right, if I know the law, but I still can't keep it, and if the power of sin within me keeps sabotaging my best intentions, I obviously need help. I realize that I don't have what it takes. I can will it, but I can't do it. I decide to do good, but I don't really do it. I decide not to do bad, but then I do it anyway. My decisions, such as they are, don't result in actions. Something has gone wrong deep within me, and it gets the better of me every time. I want to remind you, this is Paul talking right there to the church in Rome. He's the guy that came up with the fruit of the Spirit list in the first place. And yet it sort of sounds like he's completely out. Totally unattainable. Yet, this is the same guy who wrote to the church in Corinth this, and we're going to pick this up now in 1 Corinthians 9, at verse 24. He says this to this particular group of believers. He says, "Don't you know that the runners the prize run in such a way to win the prize? Now everyone who competes exercises self-control in everything. They do it to receive a perishable crown, but we an imperishable crown. So I do not run like one who runs aimlessly or box like one beating the air. Instead, I discipline my body and I bring it under strict control so that after preaching to others, I myself will not be disqualified." These seem a little strange to put together, and we're going to get there here in a second. You see, the Apostle Paul tells the Christians in Rome, the first text we read, that I really want to do what's right, but I can't do it. Yet he tells the believers in Corinth that I bring my body under strict control and I practice discipline. So when I read texts like this, I ask, which one is it, Paul? Is that fair? Do you do this? I'm hoping that as you read these things, you're like, well, this creates some tension, doesn't it? Are we doomed to just constant error and we need to accept that, kind of an apathetic approach to life? Or should we be training our tails off to get our lives under control and to get the best and to win the race? Maybe the Nike slogan of "just do it" comes to mind. Well, there's tension here, but I don't believe that Paul was confused, and I don't think that Paul was trying to mislead people. He spent his whole life ministering to people. I don't think he was trying to mislead us. And here's why. We have to keep in mind that Paul's letters These epistles is what we call them throughout the New Testament. They're not presented to us in the Bible in a chronological order. Some of us need that reminder. I need that reminder often, quite frankly, okay? And maybe you do this morning too. Most biblical historians actually date Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, that second text we read, and the letter that we're pulling our main series out of, Galatians. They actually place that well before he wrote to the church in Rome. So when Paul is teaching and preaching that he is disciplined and he's operating under strict control in order that he might win the race, and then he goes about confessing to the church in Rome that he can't control himself, and when trying to do what's right, he ends up doing what's wrong, Paul is not being crazy. Paul is trying to get some huge points across. He's trying to help his readers understand. See, Paul was telling the early Christians about human life and our basic character, our basic makeup. It's that humans want to behave one way, but they behave another. Can I get some head nods? Maybe you guys are the most disciplined people ever, and that would be sweet. We seemingly are in conflict a lot, right? We say this, we behave like this. It's human for us to try to do right and still end up doing wrong. It can be very human to feel a bit out of control. And it's a great reminder for all of us that no matter how much it may appear, because we're really good at this, we look at other people, right? And they may appear to have their act together. We go about operating in our own power, from our own desires. We are not really good at control in the way that we think we are. On the surface, it may appear like that person that maybe comes to mind for you is cool, is calm, and collected. But inside of us, we know this. Paul's owning this. There is a real battle going on. And that's why this morning it's good to be reminded that an idea of self-sufficiency in all of our potential and our purpose and finding success and even self-sufficiency in self-control does not work. We can't do this all on our own. There is something missing when we try to do that. And also it might feel a little bit defeating this morning. This was defeating for me all week, so I share this burden with you, by the way. This is my therapy. It's really not. That's a bad side note. But this is important, is that even though we might feel a little defeated, it's just because our most basic desires often do mislead us. I mean, if Paul, who is the apostle to the Gentile world, which means everyone who isn't part of God's promised nation, his chosen nation, the Jewish people, he is that apostle. And he has this war that's raging inside of him that he openly expresses throughout all his letters. And so sometimes I feel a little defeated because I think if Paul couldn't get this right and he's struggling, man, what hope is there for each of us? Anybody read the Bible like that sometimes and go, boy, what a mess? But here's the question. What if we could position ourselves to deal with our less desirable characteristics and take on a new and a different character? That's kind of what this whole series has been about, right? This whole idea of cultivating Christ's character in us. Well, then we would be on the path towards understanding Paul's point in listing self-control among the virtues of the fruit of the Spirit. See, real self-control truly does grind against some of our most basic human desires and human nature. We're kind of simple people. So what we want, and most times we're really good at pursuing that until we get what we want, right? I joke about this. I have to really watch myself because this crazy thing called Amazon that gets things to my house in one day makes it awfully easy to not practice any self-control. Because it will show up tomorrow. Isn't that amazing? There's places around the country where it'll show up in hours. You can get it later that day. That's dangerous stuff. We want what we want, when we want it, and we'll pursue it till we get it. And no matter how hard we try to put a lid on our desires, the truth is they will continue to pop up sometime, somewhere, and in some way. That can seem a little defeating, but there's good news, and it's really what we call the good news. Let me remind you this morning that the whole idea of Christianity is this. It's of being a follower of Christ, is to take on Christ's nature. It's to identify with him. Christ was crucified and resurrected in order to overthrow the power of sin. And if you know your book of Romans, the wages of sin are death. Yes, good job. If you didn't know that, it's okay. I just knew that there'd be a few people who'd jump in on that. You see, that's what Christ was crucified, was resurrected in order to overthrow the wages of sin, which is death, and he overthrew evil forever. So in our identification with Jesus through our loyal allegiance to him alone, Scripture tells us that we take on his nature as we put ourselves to death, as we die to self, as we are crucified with Christ. Now that doesn't mean literally. You with me? Please shake your head. Okay. It doesn't mean literally. We don't beat ourselves up, and we don't suffer physical and bodily punishment, at least not intentionally. It could happen. Rather, it means it spiritually. We are to surrender ourselves to a cross spiritually until we die and then are reborn spiritually. Now, we've been working our way through the fruit of the Spirit that are listed in Galatians 5, 22 and 23 for most of the summer here. But do you know what the next verse in Galatians 5, it would be now 24, says? If you don't, that's okay, because it's going to be here on the screen. You can follow along. It says this. Paul writes this down for us. He says, those who belong to Christ Jesus have nailed the passions and desire of their sinful nature to his cross and crucified them there. There it is. If you're looking for the silver bullet, the secret of self-control, it's the secret that's in every virtue that's listed in the fruit of the Spirit. They're the characteristics that we're trying to take on of Christ's nature. That's our work. It's not the human nature virtues. It's the joy, the peace, the patience, the kindness, the faithfulness, gentleness, and now self-control that Christ offers through the work of his Spirit. And Paul implores readers in the next verse that he says this, since we are living by the Spirit, let us follow the Spirit's leading in every part of our lives. Now, I know it goes against our thinking to say that in order to get self-control, you'll actually have to give up some control. It goes against our basic understanding to say that in order to live, you must die. But that's exactly what we're being reminded of today. That when we identify with Christ by taking on our own spiritual death, we then take on his life. So that when we are brought back to life in him, his Spirit now lives inside of us. This is big, heavy theological statements. So if this is like, whoa, dude, yeah, welcome to the club, right? This is heavy stuff. This is big picture things. His Spirit living inside of us then can begin to change our nature into his nature. And as his Spirit does that work, our old character begins to free up some control so that his Spirit takes over and begins to produce real self-control. Now, it's hard when we're talking about something like this to always kind of reduce it to actionable steps, but I want to give us a little bit of a pathway towards how we do this. And these are kind of big, open-minded ones to some degree. But, you know, the idea here is if you know in your own life that self-control is not a thing, that you're struggling with that and you want to begin to work towards that and position yourself to cultivate this specific virtue more intentionally, I want to give you a few ways that you can begin to do that work. And so we have a few we're going to move through quickly. The first one is admit we have a problem. Paul does that for us, right? He says, hey man, this is going out a letter to all these churches. And they're going to know that I've got a real problem. It's pretty courageous, isn't it, if you think about that? I don't always want to tell a friend I've got a problem, let alone write you all a letter about all my problems. Okay? But that is the first step. It's acknowledging that we have a problem with self-control. We often try to deny this or ignore it, but admitting our struggle is a first step on this path towards change. A second one is we have to do the work of processing our emotions. Okay, I think it is true that our feelings can and maybe even often threaten to lead us a bit astray. And we shouldn't let our emotions have all the control over our actions and our attitude. Our emotions at times actually do protect us, keep us safe. That's not a bad thing. But instead, what we have to do is we have to be honest. We have to face our emotions. We have to deal with them openly and self-reflectively so that we can take better control of them. I said it last week, and so I promise I won't say it again in future weeks, but we talk about being honest or telling the truth all the way to the bottom. It's too easy for all of us to just say, I'm really angry today because list the easiest thing, right? I can get really irritable with my kids because of the action I'm seeing out of them.